my name is Kayla and I'm an education officer at the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary in Brisbane, Australia. Now, all this week we are going to be delving into the complicated issues of animal extinction and also what leads up to that, so how animals become endangered, and looking at some of the different processes that cause animals to become endangered. But more importantly, we're also going to be discussing ways that we can help, ways that you can become a guardian for endangered species. Now, there are lots of different reasons that an animal can become endangered. I'm sure you can think of a few right now. But today, we're going to be exploring one specific reason that animals can become endangered, and this is actually quite a big one here in Australia. Now, because Australia is essentially a giant island, we are a big continent that's surrounded by water, it means that we're very vulnerable to things called introduced species. So an introduced species is an animal that is not native to an area. We have amazing native wildlife like kangaroos, koalas, platypus, Tasmanian devils, but then there are also plants and animals in Australia that are originally from somewhere else. So a few of the invasive species that we do find here in Australia, or introduced species, we've got foxes, we also have rabbits, now this is a turtle, and if you live here in Australia you might be confused because you might think, well, I thought turtles were native. We do have native turtles that do live in our rivers and creeks, and native sea turtles as well. This particular turtle is called a red-eared slider, and it is not a native species, it's an introduced species. And feral cats. Now, feral is when an animal maybe used to be a pet or used to be domesticated and then has gone out into the wild and become wild and is no longer the same as a pet animal. So all of these animals, this is just an example of some of the common ones that we see here, and all of them came to Australia in not the same way but a similar way. So how do you think these four animals came to be in Australia? Did they swim across the ocean and end up here? So the common thing about these animals is that they were all brought to Australia by people. Now, they were not brought over for exactly the same reasons. Foxes and rabbits, they were actually brought over and introduced because people wanted to hunt them for sport. They had come over from Europe, and they were used to going out and hunting for foxes, which is a native species where they were from. They wanted to make Australia feel a bit more like home where they had come from, so they brought foxes and rabbits to hunt for sport. Put that up here. Now, it's a little bit different with our cats and these red-eared sliders. These cats and turtles were originally brought over to Australia as pets. Red-eared sliders are a very common pet in North America, and people decided they wanted red-eared slider pets in Australia. So they brought them over as pets when they were little baby turtles, but then as the turtles got bigger, some people decided that they didn't want that pet turtle anymore, so instead of, maybe giving it up for adoption, they just released it into the creek or the pond behind their house and said, oh, well, this turtle likes to live in a creek, I'll just let it go. Cats originally as well brought over as pets, but then maybe people weren't looking after them as well as they could. They end up going out and becoming feral and then being really problematic. So that's the next question, I guess, is what's wrong with introduced species? Why are they problematic? Why can they lead other native animals to become endangered. Well, that's complicated as well, and it depends on the animal. If you look at things that are predatory animals, animals that hunt other animals, such as foxes and cats, why do you think a predatory animal, like a fox or a cat, would be bad news for native wildlife? If any of you have a pet cat at home, you might know this as well, but they like to go out, and it's their instinct to go and hunt. So they go and they hunt for other little native things, like small native rodents, little lizards, little snakes that might be around the backyard or around the property. So they throw off the food chain by eating native animals. But also herbivores and things like rabbits, they can also be problematic because they need to eat. So they'll go out and they'll eat all of the food in an area, and they won't leave anything left behind for the native animals, like maybe a kangaroo or a wombat that also likes to eat grass. Same thing with the red-eared slider turtles. They are a very aggressive species of turtle. They're very territorial. If they get into a river or a creek system, they can basically just take over and push everything else out, eat all of the food, kick the native turtles out of that creek, and they don't leave anything left behind. So that brings us to the question of how we can become a guardian. What are some simple ways that we can help? Well, I think a big one that is very well within our control is looking after how we manage our pets at home. So if you have a pet, whether it's something like a goldfish or a cat or a dog, it's so important to be a responsible pet owner. To do your research, know what you need to do to keep that animal safe and healthy, but also how to keep other wildlife safe and healthy in the area. So it's really important that if we have a pet, they need to remain a pet. Pets do not belong out in the wild. If you take a pet and try to release it into the wild, it will probably be very bad news for that pet because it might not be used to living in the wild. And then it could also be really bad news for the native animals in the area or the other animals in the area. So pets stay pets. And we need to look after them. One way that you can actually help if you have a pet cat. If you have a pet cat, if it's possible, it's probably better for the cat to stay as an indoor cat, where it won't be able to go out and hunt for native wildlife. But if it is an indoor-outdoor cat, a cat that likes to go out during the day, maybe try to make sure that that cat does come inside at night, because that's when cats are more likely to go out and go looking for things to hunt. And also, you can take a little collar for your pet cat and make sure that it has a little bell on it. Now this jangling bell will be a warning. So if the cat does try to sneak up on something like a bird in the garden, the bird will hear that bell and have a chance to fly away. Another thing that we can do if we do see a native species, an introduced species, a not native species, is that you can report it. And then we can also just look at how we're managing the plants that we plant around our homes. So it's not just animals that can become introduced or invasive, plants can also be invasive as well. So try to stick to planting native things in your garden. And if you are planting something around the house that's maybe not native, just make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. So planting natives, and then removing weeds or managing weeds to make sure that they don't get out of control and spread. Now, one other introduced species that is a big issue here in Queensland and really spreading from the north down towards into the south of Australia, something that people in Brisbane see quite a few of, is this animal right here. Don't know if you can see it too well, but this is the skin, just the skin, of something called a cane toad. Now, cane toad is originally from Central America, And they were brought over for a really silly reason. Their story is a bit silly. They were brought over by people because there was this little beetle that was eating the sugarcane fields in Queensland. And the farmers thought, oh, we've got to get rid of these beetles. Now, do you know the song about the old lady that swallowed the fly, and then she swallowed something to get the fly, swallowed a dog to get the cat? So they decided they were going to bring over these cane toads, introduce them into the fields, and the cane toads were going to go and eat the beetles. The problem is the cane toads that were introduced did not eat the beetles. Instead, they just started breeding and reproducing and spreading and getting bigger and bigger and spreading out and taking over. And they didn't eat the beetles, but they do eat things like native frogs, and they push native frogs out of their habitat. And a really bad thing about these guys is also on their skin, they're actually poisonous. And a lot of our native species, they're not used to seeing these poisonous frogs, poisonous toads, and they can't tell the difference between a frog that's safe to eat and an introduced cane toad that's going to make them very sick. So a lot of animals end up getting poisoned by trying to eat the cane toad. And we're going to go and have a look at some animals that have been impacted by the introduction of the cane toad. Alright guys, this lovely lizard is named Lola, and she is a lace monitor, more commonly referred to here in Australia as a goanna. Now, monitor lizards are an animal that's really been impacted by the introduction of the cane toad, which is an introduced and has become a really bad invasive species in Queensland. In fact, one type of monitor lizard, the yellow spotted monitor, their population has dropped by 90% due to being poisoned by cane toads. Now, these lizards are carnivores, so they like to eat meat. They might also eat eggs. They can eat carrion, so things that have already died, but they do also eat frogs. And unfortunately, they sometimes have a hard time distinguishing between a safe native frog, which would be a suitable thing to eat, and a cane toad, which is poisonous and can be deadly. In fact, Lola, she is actually missing her tongue, believe it or not, because at one point she did have a run-in with a cane toad. She was very lucky to survive that encounter. A lot of monitor lizards aren't that lucky, so it is really important that we try to control the population of cane toads in Australia because they are quite dangerous. That poison doesn't take long to kill them if they've tried to eat it. It can be a really big issue. There are some scientists, a group of scientists are working on trying to train monitor lizards not to eat cane toads, and they're doing that by introducing them slowly, so giving them a really small, less poisonous cane toad, like a young one, that won't kill them, but then they get to try it and try to eat it, and they realize that it's not good. They don't like it, it doesn't taste good, it doesn't make them feel very good, and then they learn not to eat it in the future. So they'll recognize those cane toads as a danger or a threat and avoid eating them. So that is some pretty exciting research that's being done, and hopefully it can help protect this species because they are super amazing, super cool. Lola is having a wonderful time sunbaking, getting all nice and warm and toasty to have energy for the rest of the day. All right, bye!